Welcome back, Internet people. In this video, we're going to do a quick painting of a black cat chickadee. Why a quick painting? Well, because it's a great way to loosen up your painting, become a better watercolor painter, and it's just plain fun. So, without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so I'm just looking at a close-up here of the drawing that I've made a screen capture of, and I'm just going to show you some of the points on it, just to simplify it in case you wanted to go this route on your own. The basically what the drawing is, when you see me painting on and sketching on, is it's essentially like I'm putting down lines, like where the boundaries are. So one of the first and most important ones would be like, where does it start and stop? You know, before you do anything that's in the middle, you know, we can kind of see now we've got this kind of shape that kind of comes down like this, right? So you could essentially draw that out. And what that tells you then is, no matter what goes on inside here, the end of the tail is here, the end of the beak is over here, the top of the head is over here, and most importantly, where is the eyeball? You'll notice in my drawing that I did this a few times, kind of moved it around to get it just right. That's the most critical part. If, for example, I got this like white area in here a little bit off, that wouldn't matter so much. What really matters, alongside of, you know, if this head was huge, right, and the body was really small, then okay, that might look funny too. You want things proportionate. But so basically the first thing you're going to start off with is you're going to put your lines, outline like where the edges are of this subject. Make sure everything fits inside that little box. So then, you know, you can move it around. You don't want to put too many eraser, like, you know, things on your paper. You don't want to be wrecking the surface of the paper. That will affect how your paint goes down. All right, let's get back to the painting. Hey everybody, before we do get started, I did want to take a minute and hear from today's sponsor of this video. That would be me. I'm the sponsor. There's no sponsor. I have like 136 subscribers. There's no way I have any sponsors. The only way I will get sponsors is if you click the like, subscribe, comment on the video, tell me what you want to see in future videos. Just say, hey Paul, you're awesome, or hey Paul, you look funny. Anything helps. It doesn't matter. Just like, subscribe, comment. Thank you. Bye-bye. For my brush, I'm using a real squirrel hair brush by Da Vinci. I quite like this brush. This brush would be considered pretty large for this size of painting. However, that's one of the things that helps contribute to the painting being loose and gives it that free-flowing kind of look. Squirrel hair brushes, especially mop brushes, hold a lot of water, so there I just pulled off a little bit of the excess water. Now, as I mentioned, I did go over the eyeball a few times, moved it around to make sure that I got it in the right spot. Now, you're probably wondering, how did I get that deep dark black for the chickadee? Well, this is simple. It's a mixture of indigo and burnt umber. Another advantage of using this large brush, it holds a lot of pigment. Now, there's not a lot of water in here, but there is a lot of pigment in here. I'm well aware of that. I know that I can move it around, and I have a plan for it later. At this stage, I'm just trying to get as much pigment on as possible in the black areas. So I'm taking extra care to avoid some of the white areas around the eye and other areas that I don't want to fill in. Nice thing about this brush is it has a very fine point, so you can actually do finer details like flick the little hairs out and little feathers, sorry. Here I'm using it again to put these kind of lines, I guess, or like the wings where the feathers open up. I'm using that fine point again. Now, as I mentioned before, I have all that pigment on and I have a plan for it later. So what am I going to do with it? I'm going to use some blossoms and I'm going to take some clean water on a clean brush and I'm going to dab them in here. And I'm basically lifting some of that pigment out. So making a natural gradation in the paint where I want it to show those highlight areas. Let's take a quick look at the reference photo here to explain that better. Here is the darker areas on the head where the blacks are here, but over here you can see these areas are lighter. So instead of painting them lighter and then adding in another darker area, what I like to do is just blob the paint on, get as much on, because it's harder to get dark values in watercolor painting than it is to get light values. So in this case, I blob it all on, then later I come back with that clean water that I just showed you and I'm plopping it in there. Now I've got some buff titanium and a lot of water, and I'm going to put that in here, and I'm using it both to add the buff titanium but also to pull some of the blacks out to give that watery kind of look where they're going to spread into the white areas. You have to be kind of careful here, but you can come back and dab it up later on, which you'll see that I do. Now I've got a more concentrated version of the buff titanium. I've also added in some raw umber, maybe some sepia, and burnt umber where I want the darker areas or more yellow areas. Here I'm grabbing some pre-existing colors, which looks to be Payne's Gray mixed with a bit of magenta. This was already on my palette. I just added a lot of water to it. You'll find on your palette you generally end up with a bunch of different grays just from mixing a bunch of colors together. You could really use anything here. I've added in a bit of blue now, which is ultramarine blue, to put into this little feather area here. I'll probably take some of that out. This is another technique that I use quite often called lifting. I'm using a lot of water and a synthetic brush to push against the pigments that I've already laid down. This makes it look like the feathers are coming down over top of the other ones. It also blends in the colors well together. I use this quite a bit in different paintings. Just be sure you're using a synthetic brush, as this will damage the hairs on a real hairbrush. It will also damage a synthetic brush, just not as fast. Now moving on to the back feather area, we're going to use some of the color that we mixed up for the head, just with a lot more water. So to that same dark black, just with a lot of water. I'm just going to kind of put this on. I'm avoiding touching the big pool of water up at the top there because there's going to be a darker pigment under there, and I don't want to bleed that in just yet. Be sure to keep an eye on some of that loose water running all over the place and dab it up where you don't want it. And just to make sure our bird is in a little blob just floating in midair, we're going to put some sort of semblance of legs or feet on kind of roughly where they go. I could have paid closer attention to this, but for the most part I just wanted representation. And now we're going to move on to the beak. I had my brush in hand, my larger quill brush, and I started putting the paint down, which I generally tend to do purely out of laziness. I'm going to jump to a smaller brush because some of the details are a little fine here and it just makes life easier. Got the smaller brush now, and I'm continuing to add in the Payne's Gray here. I'm just using a bit of clean water to take out some of the lighter areas there. You can see in the reference picture that my beak didn't start off looking the way that the one does in the picture, so now I'm trying to fix it. Now with a fine brush, I'm going to sketch in using a lot of the same pigment that we use for the head. Not a lot of water here. I'm very dry brush. I want to keep control because I want to have the edge, and I'm just basically painting the shape of this eyeball. You can see like the darker part underneath, and then above at the top you're going to see that those highlights. So I'm going to kind of paint around that, and then I will fill those in later. Again, we've got the same pigment that we mixed originally for the dark part on the head, and this is going to be the shadow of the wings that kind of come underneath the feathers there. So I've got a bit more water in that pigment, and I'm going to use it to spread down here, the shadow underneath, put some of the lines in, etc. Now the same thing here with a bit more water. Now I'm going to start to define some of these lower wing tips. The original paint I picked up was a bit too wet, so I just grabbed some straight up indigo. Now the beak has had a chance to dry, so I've got my fine brush, the same black pigment color that I mixed up originally, and I'm just adding in the definition now around the beak. We'll do so at the bottom here, put in some more dark shadow, and we'll put in the definition area at the top, and then lastly I'm going to use the same paint on my brush to define the shape of the eye, and then I will fill it in with a bit of water just to pull in some of the pigments, to take out some of those bright white areas there that are just too harsh, put some shadow areas underneath, etc. There's a little fleck of color there at the bottom of the beak. Mine's way bigger, but I don't know, I kind of like it. Don't be afraid to put some extra color in, even where it's not warranted. Now we're going to use our lifting technique here. You've still got a bit of that yellow on the brush, but it doesn't really matter. And I'm pushing the lighter area over top of that shadow area to make it, you can see now it kind of jumps up a bit. Now I've got my small brush again, loaded up with as much pigment as I can put on it. I'm going to add in some of these darker shadow areas and some finer details throughout the painting. Okay, now we're going to start and get real crazy. We've got some indigo mixed with some water, straight up indigo. And we're adding in some of these more shadowy areas. We're using the blue, the dark color, which is indigo. And it adds a bit of contrast. It breaks things up a bit. It's a great pigment for shadow areas, for details, for things like that. Now here we've got some less diluted pigment just to get that wing that I was trying to get in before, just that little tip down there. And I'll do the same thing up here to find some of these shadows. A lot of these things come together near the end of the painting. Another thing I like to do often after I put down pigment like that is use some diluted water to pull it down, to bleed it out, like you can see I'm doing here. Again, same thing right here. I'm going to try and define this shadow area to make it look like these wings are underneath the top part, which they are. And so again, I put down a lot of pigment, and now I'm using some clean water to bleed it out. I'll just wet my brush, and there we go. You can see it now. It starts to bleed down like that. Taking some of that wet water on my brush, I'm going to pull down some of that blue to give the definition to the shape of these feathers here, to try and break them up a bit. Now I have some very, very, very diluted ultramarine blue, and I'm just going to use it to put in some shadows here underneath the eye, where you can see in the reference picture that there are some little shadow areas underneath there, and also to fill in some of the white areas. They're just too bright. You know, it's not pure white on the bird. There's lots of colors and shadows in white areas. Now I'm just going to go through and sort of strengthen some of these areas, add in a few more fine details, just a few lines to break it up in here to, you know, give the impression of the feathers. Now I can look at the picture and I can see some of the values aren't correct. So this area underneath here, this is a shadow area under the wing. So I need some, it needs to be darker. You know, it's really, it's more about balance at this point, like balancing out some of the values. You don't want to have like really dark in one area and really light in another area. It just makes the painting more interesting this way. Just some dark indigo here, adding in a few more details, and that makes the painting a wrap. And thank you very much for watching. I hope you liked this video. I tried to make it as quick as possible and make it realistic as far as how I approach a painting like this, with not a lot of concern or worry. Overall, this painting, not including starting and stopping, recording, and all that other stuff, probably took me under 15 minutes. I did most of it wet on wet, with the paint being wet and the water being wet. I really didn't worry about a drawing. I didn't even tape this painting down, which I normally do. But in the end, I'm happy with it. It's a good exercise and it's a good practice. It's a good thing to do. So let me know what you think. I hope you like it, and I'll see you next time.